The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial of a young black man was about to begin. It was a case that had caught the attention of many, but for all the wrong reasons. The accused, a man in his late 20s, was charged with a serious crime. Something that, on paper, seemed like it could ruin his life. But there was one thing that didn't sit right with everyone who knew him. The evidence didn't add up. The accusation felt forced, a mistake that could happen to anyone. But the system had already decided. Sitting at the defense table was the lawyer, a man who didn't bother hiding his views. He had built a reputation for himself, one that many admired, but few knew the real cost of his success. Known for his sharp mind in the courtroom, he was also known for his open racism. He didn't try to hide it. He made it clear that some people just didn't deserve his respect, especially not black people. This lawyer didn't care about the truth. What mattered was winning, and nothing else. The jury took their seats. There was a quiet murmur in the room, but it was clear. This wasn't just another trial. This was something much bigger. The prosecutor had all the right arguments, the lawyer had all the right tactics, and yet, something about this case felt wrong. The young man was about to face a fight that was bigger than just his freedom. It was a fight for justice, for truth. But the system seemed stacked against him from the start. The lawyer wasn't a stranger to controversy. In fact, he thrived on it. For years, he'd been a respected figure in the legal world. He had a reputation for being tough, relentless, and incredibly skilled at winning cases. But there was something else that followed him around: his racism. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't something he tried to hide. His colleagues knew it, his clients knew it, and so did the public. He didn't shy away from making jokes that crossed lines or from throwing around casual comments that made others uncomfortable. Yet somehow, his ability to win cases was undeniable. Some called it brilliance. Others, who knew the real story, saw it for what it truly was: manipulation, calculated moves, and a strategy rooted in prejudice. His belief was simple: certain people were more deserving of justice than others. He had no issue taking on high-profile cases, even if it meant representing people who he thought didn't belong in the courtroom. As long as he was getting paid and winning, he didn't care about the consequences. The people he crushed along the way? To him, they were just part of the job. In this case, the young black man sitting across from him was no different. He was a pawn in the lawyer's game. The lawyer didn't see him as someone innocent who had been caught up in a corrupt system. No, to him, the man was just another client to win or lose. He wasn't interested in the truth, only the victory. It was a familiar feeling for the man who had spent years exploiting the weaknesses of the system, using his position to push his personal beliefs onto everyone else. He knew the jury wouldn't care about the lack of evidence. They'd be swayed by his words, his tactics. And if he won, that would just prove once again that people like him were always going to get ahead. The young man sitting at the defense table was named Malik. He was in his late 20s, with a quiet, reserved demeanor that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around him. Malik wasn't a criminal, not in any sense. He was a hard-working man, a son, a brother, and someone who had always tried to live a decent life. But that wasn't what mattered here. What mattered was the charge that had been leveled against him. A crime he didn't commit. Malik had no idea how he'd ended up in this situation. One wrong place, one wrong time, and suddenly his life was in the hands of a system that didn't care about him. The accusation was serious. A robbery that had left a local store owner badly hurt. The evidence was slim, based mostly on eyewitness accounts that were shaky at best. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Malik was black, and in a case like this, that was enough. The worst part? His lawyer. Malik had never met the man before, but when he found out who was representing him, he felt a sinking feeling in his chest. It was the lawyer everyone knew. The one with the racist reputation, the one who didn't care about the truth, only winning. Malik had heard the rumors. How this lawyer would use whatever tactics it took to win. He had heard the whispers about his prejudices. It was hard to feel confident knowing this man was the one standing between him and his freedom. But Malik had no choice. He didn't know what else to do. His family, his friends, everyone was counting on this lawyer to help him, even though they all knew the odds were against him. He was just a man caught in a system that had already decided his fate, and it felt like no one was listening. Malik sat silently, holding on to the smallest hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would come through in the end. The trial began, and from the very start, the atmosphere was charged. The courtroom felt heavy, as if everyone knew how this was going to end. Malik sat quietly, his heart racing in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it wasn't going to be fair. His lawyer, standing tall with an air of arrogance, wasted no time in starting his defense. He didn't look at Malik with any real concern. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, to manipulate the jury. His arguments were filled with tactics, but little substance. He played on their biases, subtly reinforcing the idea that Malik was guilty simply because of his background. He didn't care about finding the truth, all that mattered was the win. During the prosecution's opening statement, they presented the evidence against Malik. The eyewitnesses were shaky in their testimonies, but the lawyer didn't push hard enough. He didn't challenge the inconsistencies or the lack of solid proof. It was almost as if he didn't want to win the case. It was clear, the lawyer wasn't trying to prove Malik's innocence. He was trying to get through the trial without putting in much effort. Malik's nerves only grew as the trial dragged on. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was relentless. They pushed for a conviction, using every angle they could to make Malik look guilty. His lawyer did nothing to defend him. Instead, he let the case fall apart, not bothering to cross-examine witnesses or question the prosecution's evidence. When the verdict was finally announced, it felt like the world had come crashing down. Guilty. The word echoed in the courtroom, and Malik felt his heart drop. His world shattered. He couldn't believe it. How could this happen? He hadn't done anything wrong. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The jury had made their decision, and the lawyer who was supposed to defend him had failed him in the worst way possible. Malik's family, sitting in the back of the room, looked devastated. His mother's face was streaked with tears. They had trusted the system, trusted this lawyer. And now, all of that hope was gone. The days after the conviction felt like a blur. Malik was sent to prison, a place that felt cold and unforgiving. It was a place he never imagined he would end up, and now that he was here, everything felt hopeless. His cell was small, the walls bare. His mind kept replaying the trial over and over, each detail like a dagger in his chest. How had this happened? How had everything gone so wrong? His family was torn apart. His mother couldn't stop crying, and his younger sister, who had looked up to him her whole life, had trouble understanding why her brother was locked away for something he didn't do. They visited him, of course. But every time they came, the reality of the situation hit harder. It was hard to keep hope alive when everything seemed stacked against him. Malik felt like he was fading away, swallowed by a system that didn't care about his innocence or his future. But the outside world wasn't silent. News of his conviction spread quickly, especially once the details of the trial started coming out. People began to question how a man like Malik, with no solid evidence against him, could have been convicted so easily. Activists, journalists, and even public figures started to take interest in the case. There were protests calling for a review of the trial, cries for justice from people who believed that Malik had been wronged. The media picked up the story, and soon the court's decision wasn't just a local issue, it was something everyone was talking about. In the midst of all this, a new lawyer stepped forward, a woman named Jasmine, who had a reputation for taking on cases where the system had failed. She saw something that others had missed, the glaring flaws in Malik's trial. Jasmine was determined to do what the original lawyer had never bothered to do, fight for the truth. She began working on the case, sifting through the evidence, interviewing witnesses, and finding holes in the original defense that had failed Malik. She had hope, something that Malik hadn't felt in a long time. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jasmine, the new lawyer, was a force to be reckoned with. She was sharp, methodical, and passionate about getting to the truth. From the moment she took on Malik's case, it was clear that she was going to do everything in her power to make sure the wrongs were righted. Unlike Malik's previous lawyer, Jasmine didn't just want to win, she wanted justice. She wasn't going to let the system's flaws keep an innocent man behind bars. Jasmine began by digging into every detail of the original trial. She reviewed the evidence, the witness testimonies, and the way the case had been handled. What she found shocked her. There were inconsistencies, oversights, and outright mistakes in how Malik's defense had been handled. It was clear that the previous lawyer had barely tried to fight for his client. He hadn't questioned key details or properly cross-examined the prosecution's witnesses. But more than that, it seemed like he had never cared to uncover the truth in the first place. With new determination, Jasmine started looking for new evidence. She talked to witnesses who hadn't been interviewed during the first trial, uncovering details that had been overlooked. Some witnesses who had previously been too scared to speak out now came forward with their own information, casting doubt on the prosecution's case. Jasmine even found surveillance footage from the night of the alleged crime that had never been shown in court. Footage that could prove Malik's innocence. As the new trial approached, the contrast between the two lawyers couldn't have been starker. Jasmine was focused, dedicated, and compassionate. She listened to Malik, believing in him when no one else did. She had confidence in her strategy, and she made it clear that she wasn't backing down. Malik, still reeling from the aftermath of the original trial, tried to hold on to a fragile hope. He was scared, uncertain, and unsure whether this new trial could change anything. He'd been let down once, and now he was facing the overwhelming reality of a second chance. Could it work? Was there enough evidence to convince the jury? With each passing day, though, the new trial seemed more promising. Jasmine's work was starting to make a difference. People who had once doubted Malik's innocence were beginning to see the cracks in the original trial, and for the first time in a long while, Malik allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in months: hope. The new trial began, and the difference was immediately clear. The courtroom had a different energy this time, one of anticipation, curiosity, and something else: hope. Jasmine wasn't just going through the motions. She was determined to make sure Malik's side of the story was finally heard. The first few days were filled with her meticulous cross-examinations and presentation of new evidence. She had a quiet confidence that contrasted with the chaotic energy of the original trial. It was clear she had a plan, and nothing would stand in her way. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a routine questioning of a key witness, Jasmine unearthed something no one expected. The witness, a man who had originally testified for the prosecution, suddenly faltered under Jasmine's questioning. His testimony, which had been crucial to convicting Malik, was full of inconsistencies. He admitted that he hadn't seen the face of the person involved in the robbery as clearly as he had claimed before. In fact, he'd only assumed it was Malik, even though his description didn't match Malik at all. Jasmine didn't stop there. She dug deeper. She presented new surveillance footage that had never been shown during the first trial. The footage clearly showed Malik at a different location, far from the scene of the crime, at the exact time the robbery took place. The timing of the footage was perfect, and it cast serious doubt on the prosecution's narrative. The entire case against Malik was built on shaky eyewitness accounts and circumstantial evidence that now seemed utterly unreliable. As the trial progressed, even more shocking revelations came to light. Jasmine revealed that the original lawyer had never bothered to follow up on key pieces of evidence that could have exonerated Malik from the start. It became clear that the defense had been more interested in making a quick case than actually defending Malik's innocence. The original lawyer had never questioned the questionable eyewitnesses, never investigated the alibi, and never bothered to explore the flaws in the case. The deeper Jasmine went, the more the original trial's mishandling became apparent. The prosecutor, who had once been so confident of a conviction, began to stumble. Their case was falling apart. The jury, once swayed by bias and prejudice, was now forced to look at the facts. They could no longer ignore the growing evidence that Malik had been wrongfully convicted. Malik sat in his seat, watching it all unfold. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The truth was finally being told. The feeling was surreal, almost too good to be true. But as the trial went on, it became clear. The injustice that had once seemed so permanent was now starting to unravel. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. After days of shocking revelations and new evidence that exposed the flaws in Malik's original trial, the tension in the room was palpable. Jasmine had done her job. The truth had been laid out in front of everyone, and now it was in the hands of the jury. Malik sat, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to focus on anything but the sound of his own breath. He had never been this nervous in his life. Everything he had fought for, his freedom, his dignity, his future, depended on the next few minutes. The jury filed back into the room, their faces serious. There was no need for theatrics, no dramatic pauses. The four persons stood and looked out at the courtroom, glancing at Malik, his lawyer, the prosecutor. And then the words came. Not guilty. It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from Malik's shoulders. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. For a long moment, he simply sat there, staring at the empty space in front of him. Not guilty. The words echoed in his mind, but they didn't feel real. Then slowly, Malik turned to Jasmine. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes. Relief, triumph, and a deep satisfaction. She had done it. She had brought the truth to light, and she had fought for Malik when no one else had. Malik stood up, his legs weak, and slowly walked toward her. His family, sitting in the back of the room, had already started to stand, their faces filled with joy and disbelief. His mother was crying, but these were tears of happiness. Tears of relief. The room was filled with murmurs, some of shock, some of disbelief, but for Malik none of that mattered. He was free. He was finally free.